That morning, my son called and casually mentioned he had forged my signature to sell my property so he could pay for his lavish wedding. He told me to sit quietly in the back and not embarrass him. I did not scream. I did not cry. A smile was all I gave. Because what my son did not know was that the anonymous company he illegally sold my land to was actually owned by me. When his wedding day came, I did not just bring a gift. I brought the FBI. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not bought with stolen money. It was exactly 6 in the morning when the phone rang. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking my usual black coffee. I am Gordon Mitchell, 75 years old and a man who has learned to appreciate the quiet hours of the dawn. But that peace shattered the moment I heard my son Malcolm on the other end of the line. There was no greeting. I drove my 1998 Chevy pickup truck across the city, leaving the familiar streets of the South Side behind. The scenery slowly changed. The cracked pavements and corner stores faded away, replaced by massive iron gates, towering oak trees, and private driveways. I was heading to the Oakmont Country Club for my son's rehearsal dinner. It is a place built of marble and glass, a fortress designed specifically to keep people who look like me on the outside. I pulled up to the grand entrance. A young valet in a crisp white uniform stepped forward. He stopped when he saw the faded paint on my truck hood. He looked at my vehicle, and then he looked at my face. He did not open my door. He just stood there expecting me to ask for directions to the delivery entrance. I put the truck in park, stepped out, and handed him the keys along with a $20 bill. He blinked in shock. I did not say a word. I just turned and walked up the wide stone steps. I was wearing a gray suit. He scrambled forward, pushing past the shattered crystal glasses and the overturned chairs. He did not walk toward his new wife. He did not walk toward his furious father-in-law. He crawled directly toward me. He fell to his knees, right in front of my worn work boots. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the hard marble echoed in the silent ballroom. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of pure panic. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and grabbed the fabric of my faded gray pants. He clung to me like a drowning man holding onto a life raft. He ignored the frosting dripping from his sleeves. He ignored the fact that his entire fake high society world had just collapsed around him. "Dad," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Dad, please, you have to stop this. You have to help me." I looked down at him. I did not pull my leg away, but I did not reach down to comfort him either. I stood perfectly still, letting him feel the absolute coldness of my presence. "You have millions of dollars, Dad," Malcolm begged, his words tumbling out in a frantic, rushed whisper. "You own this entire estate. You own the company that bought the land. $500,000 is nothing to you. It is just pocket change for you. Please, Dad, just pay off the federal tax lien. Just clear the debt. Call your lawyer right now and tell her to withdraw the notification. Tell the authorities it was all just a huge misunderstanding. Tell them I had your permission to sell the South Side lot. He was actually asking me to commit perjury. He was asking me to lie to the federal government to cover up his grand larceny. He was still trying to find a shortcut to escape the consequences of his own terrible choices. I can fix this, Dad." Malcolm continued, sobbing openly now. "I will pay you back every single penny, I swear. I will work for you. I will do whatever you want. Just do not let them send me to federal prison. Do not let them take everything away from me. I am your son. Please remember that I am your son." He played the family card. After spending the entire weekend treating me like a hired servant, after excluding me from his wedding photos, after telling me not to embarrass him, he suddenly remembered that we shared the same blood. He wanted to use my love as a shield to protect himself from the law. I stared down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor. I remembered the long nights I spent fixing diesel engines in the freezing cold just to put food on his plate. I remembered his mother Vivian working double shifts so we could buy the very land he had just stolen from us. He had taken all of that sacrifice, all of that unconditional love, and he had thrown it away to buy the approval of people who secretly hated him. I looked into his terrified eyes. I did not feel a single drop of pity. "You stopped being my son the moment you locked the door in that restroom," I said. My voice was low, but it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. It was steady and completely devoid of any warmth. Malcolm froze. His hands slowly loosened their grip on my pants. He stared up at me, his breath hitching in his throat. You looked me dead in the eyes and threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent. I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. You threatened to hire a corrupt psychiatrist to sign fake medical papers. You threatened to strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my legal rights. You were perfectly willing to lock your own father inside a state-run psychiatric ward just to hide your theft. You were going to let me rot in a tiny room thinking I had lost my mind, all so you could pay for some ice sculptures and expensive champagne. Malcolm opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The truth of his own wicked cruelty paralyzed him. You ask me to remember that you are my son, I said, stepping back so his hands fell away from my legs entirely. A real son does not steal his family legacy to impress a bankrupt racist who mocks his background. A real son does not treat his father like garbage. You are not asking me to save you because you love me. You are asking me to save you because you finally realized I am the only person in this room who actually has real power. I paused, letting the silence stretch out between us. I thought about my late wife. I thought about the beautiful, strong black woman who had held our family together through the darkest times. Vivian would be absolutely ashamed of the man you have become, I told him. Hearing his mother's name hit him harder than anything else I had said. Malcolm closed his eyes and let out a broken, agonizing sob. He knew how much Vivian had sacrificed for him. He knew that she had always warned him not to let money corrupt his soul. He had ignored her warnings, and now he was reaping the exact harvest he had planted. I could write a check right now and make all of your problems disappear, I told him. I could pay off the Internal Revenue Service and make Richard bankruptcy vanish. But I will not spend a single dime of my money to rescue a thief from the consequences of his own actions. If I save you today, you will never learn what an honest dollar actually costs. You will spend the rest of your life selling your soul to the highest bidder. You made your choice, Malcolm. Now you have to pay the invoice. Malcolm slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor. He was completely defeated. He had hit absolute rock bottom, and he knew there was no secret safety net waiting to catch him. He was alone with his crimes. Suddenly, the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom shifted. The classical music that had been playing softly over the speakers was abruptly cut off. A strange, eerie silence blanketed the massive room. Then the shadows dancing across the imported marble floor began to change colors. Flashes of intense red and blue light pierced through the giant stained glass windows of the estate. The sweeping, rhythmic flashes illuminated the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. The flashing lights painted the white walls with the undeniable colors of law enforcement. A low collective murmur of absolute panic swept through the crowd. The city councilmen and the corporate executives immediately understood what those lights meant. They began backing away from the center of the room, desperately trying to distance themselves from Richard and Malcolm. Nobody wanted to be caught standing next to a federal investigation. The low wailing sound of approaching sirens grew louder and louder until it surrounded the entire property. The trap was finally closing. Richard spun around, looking frantically toward the back exit. He took 2 steps toward the catering kitchen, looking for a way to escape, but Evelyn stepped smoothly into his path. She simply crossed her arms and gave him a look that dared him to try and run. Richard stopped, his shoulders sagging in complete surrender. He knew there was nowhere to hide. Chloe stood frozen by the sweetheart table, gripping her ruined wedding dress, her eyes wide with shock as the reality of her new life arrived at the front door. The heavy brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned simultaneously. The massive wooden doors swung open with a loud, dramatic crash that echoed over the panic of the crowd. 6 federal agents stepped into the pristine reception hall. They were wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed clearly across the back. They moved with absolute military precision. They were flanked by several uniformed local police officers who immediately moved to secure all the exits of the room. The illusion of the high society wedding was completely shattered, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a federal raid. Special Agent Miller walked through the center of the formation. He was a tall, imposing man with a serious, uncompromising expression. He had seen hundreds of white-collar criminals try to hide their theft behind expensive suits and fancy parties. He was not impressed by the crystal chandeliers or the caviar. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes immediately identifying his targets. He saw Richard standing near the head table, pale and trembling. He saw Malcolm kneeling on the floor, covered in cake frosting, completely broken. And then he saw me. Agent Miller walked straight down the center aisle, stepping over the crushed white rose petals. He did not look at the crying bride. He did not look at the panicking guests. He walked directly toward the head table, bringing the full weight of the United States government right into the middle of their perfect wedding. The end game had officially arrived. Special Agent Miller did not slow his pace as he crossed the ruined dance floor. The string quartet in the corner of the ballroom had stopped playing their lively reception music, but a soft, classical melody was still piping through the overhead speakers. It was an elegant violin concerto playing quietly in the background, creating a surreal soundtrack for the absolute destruction of a high society empire. Miller stopped right in front of the head table. He did not look at me. He did not need to. We had already spoken. He turned his cold professional gaze directly onto Richard. Richard was leaning heavily against the marble pillar, his face pale and covered in a sheen of terrified sweat. Agent Miller pulled a folded federal warrant from his dark windbreaker. It was clean, perfectly pressed, but undeniably out of style. I bought it 15 years ago for a funeral. It served its purpose tonight. It made me look exactly like the man they wanted me to be. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the private dining hall. The room was dripping with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a golden glow over tables covered in white silk. Waiters in black ties glided across the room carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. I stood near the entrance, taking it all in. Then I saw them. Richard and Susan, Chloe parents. They were holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by their wealthy friends. Susan was draped in heavy pearls and a silk dress that cost more than some people earn in a month. Richard wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit him perfectly. They turned their heads and spotted me standing by the door. The bright smiles dropped from their faces in an instant. Richard Sterling. Agent Miller announced, his voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud and wire fraud. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Richard did not try to run. He did not try to argue. The arrogant corporate executive who had spent the entire evening insulting my clothes and my background completely vanished. In his place stood a broken, pathetic man. Richard's legs gave out and he collapsed onto his knees. He began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. He wailed like a terrified child. He looked up at his wife Susan, begging her to call their lawyers, begging her to do something. But Susan took a massive step away from him. She turned her face away entirely, refusing to look at the man who had just dragged their entire family into federal prison. Two armed officers stepped forward. They grabbed Richard by his expensive tailored arms and pulled him to his feet. They twisted his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly over the soft violin music playing from the ceiling. That sound was the final gavel dropping on his fake logistics empire. Then Agent Miller turned his attention to the floor. Malcolm was still kneeling in the ruins of the $5,000 wedding cake. The frosting was smeared across his custom white tuxedo. He looked up at the federal agents with wide, unblinking eyes. Agent Miller did not show an ounce of pity. Malcolm Mitchell Miller said, reading from a second warrant, "You are under arrest for grand larceny, identity theft, and federal wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Two agents reached down and hauled my son to his feet. Malcolm did not resist. His body was completely limp. They pulled his arms behind his back. Click. Another set of steel handcuffs locked into place. I stood perfectly still, watching the officers secure the heavy chains around my own flesh and blood. I watched them read him his rights as they patted down his ruined tuxedo. He looked so small. He looked nothing like the arrogant groom who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He was just a thief facing the crushing weight of the United States government. Chloe watched her father and her new husband being restrained by federal agents. The reality of her situation completely shattered her mind. She realized that she was not marrying into a wealthy family. She realized that her father's business was dead and that she was now legally tied to a man going to prison. Panic took over her entire body. She looked wildly around the room, searching for a way out, searching for anyone who could save her from this nightmare. Her eyes finally landed on me. I was standing near the edge of the stage, calm and completely untouched by the chaos. She realized in that exact moment that I was the only person in the room who held any actual power. I was the billionaire who owned the estate. I was the man who controlled the company that bought the stolen land. Chloe let out a desperate sobbing gasp and ran toward me. She tripped over the hem of her designer wedding gown, but she kept running. She threw herself in front of me, gasping for air. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined. Thick black tracks of mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her face with dark, ugly lines. "Mr. Mitchell," she cried, her voice cracking with hysterical desperation. "Mr. Mitchell, please, you have to stop this. You own this venue. You own the company. You can tell the federal agents it was a mistake. Tell them you gave Malcolm permission to sell the land. Please do not press charges." I looked down at her. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. This was the same woman who had laughed in the bridal suite about draining my pension the moment I died. This was the woman who had ordered me to carry heavy oak tables just to humiliate me. I did not step back. I just stared right through her frantic, tear-filled eyes. "I am innocent," Chloe sobbed, reaching out, trying to grab the sleeve of my faded gray suit. "I did not know about the forged signature. I did not know about the tax lien. My reputation will be completely ruined in this city. Nobody will ever hire me. Nobody will ever associate with me. You are a wealthy man. You can make this all go away. Please have mercy on me." I looked at her shaking hands and her ruined mascara. I kept my voice low so only she could hear the absolute finality in my words. "You did not want mercy, Chloe," I said, my tone as cold as winter ice. "You wanted my retirement fund. You stood in that bridal suite and you laughed about bleeding an old man dry to save your bankrupt father. You thought you found a useful idiot in my son. You thought you could strip my family of everything we built." Chloe froze. The breath caught in her throat. She realized I had heard every single word she said behind closed doors. She realized I knew exactly how dark and greedy her soul truly was. "You wanted a spectacular wedding, Chloe," I continued, looking at her ruined dress. "You wanted a celebration that nobody in your high society circles would ever forget. Well, you got exactly what you asked for. Consider this my wedding gift." I turned my head away from her, dismissing her entire existence. Chloe collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, knowing her life as she knew it was over. The wealthy guests in the ballroom finally broke their paralyzed silence. The sight of federal agents marching through the room with handcuffs had completely shattered their polite high society composure. Panic rippled through the crowd like a wildfire. City councilmen, corporate executives, and elite socialites realized they were standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene. They realized their names might be pulled into a grand jury investigation regarding Richard and his fraudulent business dealings. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Men in expensive tuxedos grabbed their wives by the arms and began power walking toward the exit doors. Women in imported silk dresses covered their faces with their expensive clutch purses, desperately trying to hide from the few cell phone cameras that were still recording the disaster. They shoved past each other, leaving behind their coats, their purses, and their untouched plates of beluga caviar. They scrambled for the main doors, pouring out of the ballroom and running across the manicured lawns toward the valet parking lot. The elegant country club was reduced to a chaotic disaster zone in a matter of minutes. The massive crystal chandeliers shone down on overturned chairs, shattered champagne glasses, and abandoned tables. The pristine white and gold aesthetic was dead replaced by flashing red and blue police lights reflecting off the tall glass windows. I stood beside Evelyn, watching the mass exodus of the fake elites. They were running away like rats fleeing a sinking ship. They had spent the entire evening looking down their noses at me, but now they were the ones running away in terror and disgrace. I slowly turned my attention back to the center of the room. Agent Miller and his team were escorting Richard and Malcolm toward the main exit. Richard was still weeping, his head hanging low in absolute shame. Malcolm walked behind him, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. My son shuffled across the marble floor, his ruined white tuxedo serving as a massive, glaring symbol of his greed. As they walked past me, Malcolm lifted his head one last time. He looked into my eyes. There was no anger left in him. There was only a hollow, terrified realization that he had thrown his entire life away. I did not look away. I held his gaze until he was pushed through the heavy wooden doors and out into the cold night air. I stood alone in the center of my estate, watching the flashing police lights fade into the distance. My chest felt incredibly tight. It hurts. It hurts a father to watch his own flesh and blood being hauled away in steel chains. It hurts to know that the boy I raised had chosen the path of a criminal. But I also knew I had done the only thing I could do. I could not let him infect the legacy my wife and I built. I could not let him sell his soul to a family of racist predators. Sometimes the only way to save the body is to perform a painful, necessary surgery. You have to cut out the cancer before it destroys everything else. I took a deep breath, letting the silence of the empty ballroom wash over me. The surgery was complete. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the grand stone portico of the estate. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the massive oak trees scattered across the front lawn. Malcolm was being escorted down the wide marble steps by 2 federal agents. His custom white tuxedo was completely ruined. It was covered in dirt and smashed vanilla cake frosting, representing a physical manifestation of his spectacular failure. Richard was already locked in the back of a separate police vehicle, weeping into his hands like a broken child. But Malcolm was fighting. He was dragging his feet against the pavement, trying desperately to slow the agents down. They pushed him toward the open door of the black police cruiser. He twisted his body around and looked back at the mansion. He saw me standing alone at the top of the stairs, his face contorted with absolute unhinged rage. He did not look like a man who regretted his terrible crimes. He looked like a spoiled boy throwing a tantrum because he finally got caught by the adults. They looked at me the way a person looks at a stray dog that managed to wander into a pristine living room. I was not family to them. I was not even a guest. I was an unfortunate blemish on their perfect evening. I scanned the room and saw Malcolm standing near the bar. My son, the boy I raised with my own 2 hands. He looked over and our eyes met. Did he smile? Did he walk across the room to welcome his father? No. He quickly looked away, shifting his weight and staring down into his glass of whiskey. He was ashamed of the man who worked 3 brutal shifts a day so Malcolm could attend universities with ivy on the walls. Chloe noticed me next. She leaned over and whispered something into her mother's ear. Susan wrinkled her nose in disgust and took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. I did not flinch. I kept my posture straight and my face completely blank. I walked over to a small, empty table in the far corner, away from the center of attention. "You destroyed my life," he yelled at me, his voice cracking and echoing across the quiet, manicured lawns. "You took everything from me. You planned this whole thing just to ruin me." I walked slowly down the stone steps. The federal agents paused for a moment, recognizing my absolute authority on my own property. I walked right up to the open window of the police cruiser. I looked at the son I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just looked at him and delivered the cold, heavy truth. "I did not destroy your life, Malcolm," I said, my tone perfectly steady and completely empty of emotion. "You forged my signature on a legal document. You stole my land. You tried to buy your way into a family of racist predators who viewed you as nothing more than a convenient bank account. You made those choices completely on your own. I did not force you to commit federal wire fraud. I did not force you to threaten me in a restroom and tell me you were going to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to hide your theft. You dug your own grave. I just handed you the shovel and let you keep digging." He stared at me, tears of pure frustration streaming down his face. "But Dad, I am your son," he whispered, pleading one last pathetic time. "You stopped acting like my son the moment you sold your soul for a seat at their table," I replied. "I just let you experience the absolute consequences of your own actions. I am no longer your safety net. Surviving this is on you now." I stepped back from the vehicle. I gave a short nod to Agent Miller. The federal agent slammed the heavy car door shut, severing the connection between me and the boy I used to know. I turned my back on the flashing police lights and walked back through the heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom. The silence inside was completely deafening. The wealthy elite guests were entirely gone. The city councilmen and the arrogant corporate executives had fled into the night, leaving behind a massive trail of absolute destruction. Overturned chairs, shattered crystal glasses, and half-eaten plates of expensive beluga caviar littered the imported marble floor. The pristine white and gold aesthetic of the high society wedding was completely dead. It was nothing more than a ghost town of broken egos and shattered illusions. The only people left in the massive room were the venue coordinators and the catering staff. They were standing near the swinging kitchen doors, clustered together in absolute shock. They had witnessed the entire spectacle unfold. They had watched the poor old black man from the back table systematically dismantle a corrupt billionaire and send the arrogant groom to federal prison. They looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep respect. They knew exactly who owned the building now. I walked across the ruined dance floor, stepping over the crushed white orchids and the smeared vanilla frosting from the $5,000 wedding cake. I approached the head catering manager. He was a young man looking completely terrified, unsure if he was about to lose his job because the wedding was a federal crime scene. "Do not throw any of this away," I told him, gesturing to the massive buffet stations and the untouched plates of expensive food. This was a $150,000 reception. There is enough high-quality food here to feed an entire neighborhood. I want you to instruct your staff to pack up every single untouched item right now. The roasted chicken, the filet mignon, the side dishes, the artisan breads. Pack it all into heavy-duty transport containers. The manager nodded quickly, pulling a small notepad from his black apron. "Yes, sir, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Where do you want us to send it?" I looked at the mountains of wasted excess sitting on the tables. "Send it to the community centers and the homeless shelters down on the south side," I instructed clearly. The exact same neighborhood my son was so desperately ashamed of. "Deliver it tonight. Make sure the struggling families down there get a hot meal." The manager swallowed hard and nodded again. "We will get right on it, sir," he said, turning to mobilize his kitchen crew. I stopped him before he could walk away. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my checkbook. "And listen to me carefully," I added, my voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. "I know Chloe and her bankrupt father treated your staff like garbage today. I know she screamed at your servers and insulted your crew. I am the owner of this estate, and I do not tolerate any disrespect on my property. Calculate the total hours your entire team worked today. Double your hourly rate for every single person in this kitchen. Put it on my tab." The manager looked at me, his eyes wide with immense gratitude. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. I gave him a brief nod and turned away, leaving the hard-working staff to clean up the wreckage of a fraudulent empire. I walked down the long, silent hallway of the estate, leaving the grand ballroom behind me for good. The heavy silence of the massive stone mansion felt incredibly peaceful. The toxic energy of Richard and Susan, the arrogant entitlement of Chloe, the desperate greed of Malcolm, it was all completely purged from the building. I pushed open the side exit doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The valet circle was entirely empty. The luxury sports cars and the imported sedans of the wealthy elites had all vanished in a blind panic. The only vehicles left in the massive private driveway were two cars. Evelyn was standing next to her sleek black Porsche. She was holding her heavy leather briefcase, the one containing the federal tax lien documents and the corporate deeds that had just destroyed an entire lineage of arrogant thieves. She looked exhausted but absolutely victorious. She had executed a flawless legal strike perfectly timed to the exact second. I walked over to my beat-up 1998 Chevy pickup truck parked just a few feet away from her sports car. I reached into the pocket of my faded gray suit and pulled out my keys. I looked over at Evelyn. She did not say a single word to me. She just looked at my face and gave a slow, firm nod of profound mutual respect. We had done exactly what we set out to do. We had protected the vast legacy my late wife Vivian and I had built from the ground up with our bare hands. I nodded back to her, acknowledging the silent, complete victory. Evelyn opened the door of her sports car, slid into the leather driver's seat, and started the engine. She drove away down the winding paved road, disappearing into the darkness of the city. I stood alone in the driveway for a long moment. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands in the pale moonlight. They were the hands of a mechanic. The hands of a man who knew how to build things that actually lasted through storms and hardships. I opened the heavy metal door of my old Chevy and climbed into the driver's seat. The worn fabric of the seat felt incredibly familiar and comforting. I put the key into the ignition and turned it forward. The old engine roared to life, immediately purring with a deep, steady, reliable rumble. It was a good machine. It did not need a fresh coat of expensive paint or a luxury badge to prove its undeniable worth. It just did exactly what it was supposed to do without complaining. I shifted the heavy truck into gear and pressed my boot against the gas pedal. I drove slowly down the long private driveway of my massive estate. I passed through the tall iron gates, leaving the flashing red and blue lights of the remaining police cruisers far behind me. I rolled down the window, letting the cold night wind rush into the cabin, clearing my mind completely. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. There was absolutely nothing left to see back there. I had performed a painful but entirely necessary surgery. I had cut out the cancer of greed and betrayal before it could infect the rest of my peaceful life. The wreckage of my son and his terrible choices was entirely his own burden to navigate now. The long road ahead of me was dark, but my mind was completely clear. The empire I built was safe, and the future belonged entirely to me. 6 months had passed since the flashing lights of the federal vehicles faded into the dark night. The bitter winter wind whipped across the concrete parking lot of the federal penitentiary. I parked my 1998 Chevy pickup truck in the visitor section. I turned off the engine and sat in the heavy silence for a moment. The massive gray walls of the prison loomed in front of me, surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. This was not a place for men who wanted to pretend they were high society royalty. This was a place where illusions went to die and reality hit you like a cinder block. I stepped out of the truck and walked through the heavy metal security doors. I passed through the metal detectors and the pat-downs without a single complaint. I followed a stern-looking guard down a long fluorescent-lit corridor until we reached the visitation room. It was a bleak, sterile room divided perfectly in half by a thick wall of bulletproof plexiglass. I walked over to my assigned booth and sat down on the hard plastic chair. I waited. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door on the other side of the glass buzzed open. Malcolm walked into the room. He was wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. I sat down and watched the room. I let them believe they held all the power. It did not take long for Richard to make his move. I was standing near the edge of the mahogany bar waiting for a simple glass of sparkling water when I felt a heavy, aggressive hand clamp down on my shoulder. I turned around. Richard stood there puffing out his chest. He smelled strongly of scotch and expensive cologne. "Gordon, my man," Richard said. His voice was deliberately loud, carrying over the music so the bartender could hear, but his eyes were dead and cold. "I am glad you could make the drive out here. Did you have any trouble finding the place? We usually do not see your type of vehicle in the valet line." It gave the staff quite a shock. "I found it just fine, Richard," I replied evenly, keeping my voice low and steady. Richard leaned in closer, invading my personal space. He looked me up and down, analyzing my old gray suit with visible distaste. "Look, Gordon, we are all family now." The custom white tuxedo and the expensive haircut were completely gone. He looked terribly thin. His cheeks were hollow, and the arrogant posture he used to carry around the country club had completely evaporated. He shuffled toward the booth, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He sat down on the plastic chair opposite me. He did not look me in the eyes right away. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy black telephone receiver from the wall. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. We sat there in silence for a long time. The static humming on the line was the only sound between us. Finally, Malcolm raised his head. His eyes were dark and exhausted, carrying the heavy weight of a man who had lost absolutely everything in the blink of an eye. "Chloe annulled the marriage," Malcolm said, his voice barely above a raspy whisper echoing through the cheap plastic receiver. "She filed the paperwork the very next morning. She told the judge I defrauded her and hid my criminal debts. The wealthy family he had stolen my land to impress had discarded him like a piece of garbage the second the money ran dry. Richard took a plea deal with the federal prosecutors." Malcolm continued, swallowing hard as tears welled up in his tired eyes. "He threw me completely under the bus, Dad. He testified that I orchestrated the entire wire fraud scheme alone and that he was just an innocent victim of my deception. He got house arrest and probation. The judge gave me 5 years in a maximum security facility." I listened to his trembling voice through the static of the prison telephone. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes and the defeated slump of his narrow shoulders. Any other father might have broken down crying. Any other father might have slammed his fists against the thick plexiglass and cursed the unfairness of the federal justice system. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer him a warm smile of superficial comfort. I looked directly into his desperate eyes, and I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Good," I said, my voice completely steady and unshakable, transmitting through the receiver with absolute clarity. 5 years is exactly what you need. 5 years is enough time for you to sit in a small concrete cell and read every book in the prison library. It is enough time for you to work out every single day and sweat out the arrogance that poisoned your mind. It is enough time for you to finally strip away the fake upper-class identity you tried to buy with stolen money and figure out how to actually be a man." Malcolm blinked, tears spilling over his eyelashes and running down his hollow cheeks. He gripped the black telephone receiver tighter, his knuckles turning white. "But Dad, it is horrible in here. he pleaded, his voice cracking with the desperation of a scared boy. The food is terrible. The days are so long and loud, I have absolutely nothing left. Chloe took all the money from our joint accounts before the federal agents could freeze them. I do not even have enough funds to buy basic supplies from the commissary. I need to buy soap and extra blankets. Dad, please, you have millions of dollars sitting in your corporate accounts. Just wire a few $100s into my commissary fund so I can survive in here. Please, Dad, I am begging you. I looked at the son I had raised from a baby. I remembered the long, brutal nights I spent working as a mechanic in the freezing Chicago winters, just so I could buy him new shoes for private school. I remembered his mother Vivian clipping coupons at the kitchen table to make sure we never missed a tuition payment. He had taken all of that sacrifice, all of that deep, unconditional love, and thrown it directly into a fire to impress a racist, bankrupt billionaire. I stared at him through the thick, bulletproof glass. No, I replied, my tone leaving zero room for debate or negotiation. I will not send you a single penny, Malcolm. You are not going to survive in there on my dime. You want money for soap and extra blankets. You are going to walk down to the prison laundry room, and you are going to ask the guards for a job. You are going to wash the dirty jumpsuits of murderers and thieves for 40 cents an hour. You are going to scrub floors and fold heavy canvas sheets until your hands are calloused and your back aches. You need to learn exactly what an honest dollar feels like. You need to understand the physical weight of hard work because you clearly forgot the lessons your mother and I taught you. Malcolm stared at me through the thick barrier separating our worlds. The harsh fluorescent lights of the visitation room reflected off the glass, highlighting the absolute devastation on his face. He realized in that exact moment that there were no more shortcuts left for him to take. There were no more fake smiles, no more stolen deeds, and no more wealthy in-laws to hide behind. He was entirely stripped bare, forced to face the raw, unfiltered reality of his own catastrophic choices. He pressed his free hand against his forehead and began to weep. They were not the manipulative tears of a man trying to escape punishment. They were not the angry tears of an arrogant boy who got caught breaking the rules. They were the deep, agonizing tears of genuine, profound regret. His chest heaved with heavy, violent sobs as he cried for the man he could have been and the legacy he had so foolishly destroyed. "I am sorry, Dad," Malcolm whispered through the heavy sobs, his voice breaking over the phone line. "I am so incredibly sorry. I let that family poison my mind. I wanted them to accept me so badly that I turned my back on everything you and Mom built for us. I looked down on your truck and your work boots because I was terrified they would look down on me. I forgot who we were, Dad. I forgot where I came from. I am so sorry." I watched my son cry. The pain in his voice was real, and it echoed deep inside my own chest. It always hurts a father to see his child broken and bleeding on the floor, even if the child built the trap himself. I did not hate him. I never hated him. I just needed to burn away the rot before it consumed his soul completely. I slowly lifted my rough, calloused hand and pressed it flat against the cold, bulletproof plexiglass. Malcolm looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He lifted his own shaking hand and pressed it against the glass, aligning his fingers perfectly with mine through the thick barrier. I looked directly into his soul. "When you finish your 5 years," I said, my voice softening, just a fraction, carrying the quiet, enduring strength of a father, absolute love. "When you walk out of those heavy steel gates, a free man, the door to my house will be wide open for you. There will be a hot meal waiting on the table and a roof over your head. I will always be your father, and you will always be my son. But hear me clearly, Malcolm, my wallet is closed to you forever. You will never see another dime of my wealth. You are going to have to rebuild your life with your own 2 hands just like I did." Malcolm nodded slowly, his tears falling onto his orange jumpsuit. He understood. He finally understood the true cost of respect. "I am going to build it right this time, Dad," he promised, his voice quiet but steady. "I believe you, son," I replied. I held my hand against the glass for one more second, letting him feel the silent promise of a fresh start. Then I gently placed the black telephone receiver back onto the metal hook, terminating the connection. I stood up from the plastic chair, turned my back on the visitation booth, and walked down the long gray corridor without looking over my shoulder. I walked out of the federal penitentiary and stepped into the freezing winter air. I climbed into my old, reliable Chevy truck, turned the key, and drove away. leaving my son behind to finally become a man. The warm summer sun beat down on the pavement of the south side. I stood on the edge of the exact same plot of land my son had tried to steal from me 6 months ago. It was no longer an empty patch of dirt covered in overgrown weeds and broken glass. It was no longer the forgotten corner of the city that Malcolm had been so incredibly ashamed of. Today the ground was vibrating with the heavy rhythmic pounding of massive construction equipment. Giant yellow excavators and tall steel cranes dominated the skyline, reaching up into the clear blue clouds. I stood there with my hands in the pockets of my faded denim jacket, watching a crew of 50 men and women pouring fresh concrete and welding thick steel beams together. This was the dirt my late wife Vivian and I had purchased 40 years ago with cash we bled for. Malcolm thought this land was completely worthless. He thought it was just a cheap asset he could liquidate to buy his way into a racist family. But Malcolm lacked vision. He only saw the dirt. He never understood the foundation. I watched the sparks fly from the welding torches raining down like fireworks over the construction site. This massive structure rising from the ground was going to be a state-of-the-art facility. It spanned an entire city block featuring modern glass windows and reinforced brick walls that paid homage to the industrial history of Chicago. The neighborhood residents were standing on the sidewalks across the street, pointing and smiling at the massive transformation. For decades, the city council had completely ignored this district. They refused to zone commercial permits. They refused to invest in infrastructure. So I did it myself. I used the very same multi-million-dollar shell companies my son tried to exploit to legally force the city to approve the building permits. I did not ask for permission. And because we are family, I want to help you out. Tomorrow is a very big day for Chloe. We have city councilmen coming. We have major corporate partners flying in from New York. It is a high society crowd, and appearance is everything. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a folded stack of crisp bills. He glanced around the room to make sure none of his wealthy friends were watching, then slid the money directly into the breast pocket of my old suit. "I want you to take this," Richard whispered. His tone was dripping with toxic fake sympathy. "It is $500. Do me a favor and go to the tailor downtown first thing in the morning. Rent yourself a proper tuxedo. Get a haircut. We just want everything to be perfect tomorrow. We do not want our important guests thinking Malcolm came from the slums. Do we?" The slums. The word hung in the air between us like poison. I leveraged my invisible wealth and I built it right in the middle of the neighborhood they abandoned. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb next to the construction site. Evelyn, my corporate lawyer, stepped out into the summer heat. She was wearing her usual sharp black suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. She did not mind the dust or the loud noise of the heavy machinery. She walked directly over to me, navigating the rough terrain in her expensive shoes with complete confidence. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly stamped legal documents. She handed them to me with a look of profound satisfaction. I looked down at the crisp white paper. The state registration was officially complete. The massive building rising in front of us was now legally incorporated and permanently endowed. It was officially named the Vivian Mitchell Center for Trade and Business. I traced my rough thumb over my late wife's name printed in bold black ink. Evelyn stood beside me watching the construction crews pouring the final layer of the foundation. She told me the initial funding was fully secured in an unbreakable trust. I had liquidated several of my overseas assets and poured $10 million directly into this specific project. I was funding full comprehensive scholarships for young African American men and women from the neighborhood. They were not going to learn how to manipulate corporate stock or forge legal signatures. They were going to learn real, tangible skills. The curriculum was strictly focused on master plumbing, advanced electrical engineering, commercial heating and cooling repair, and real estate investing. I was giving them the exact same tools that had saved my life. I was teaching them how to build physical empires with their own two hands, so they would never have to depend on a bank that hated them. Malcolm had completely rejected this legacy. He thought manual labor was a disease. He thought wearing a white tuxedo and drinking imported champagne made him a man of value. He traded his blood right to this empire for a fake smile from a bankrupt billionaire. So I took the inheritance he threw away, and I gave it to the kids on the street who actually wanted to work for it. The heavy metal gates of the construction site swung open to let a delivery truck inside. A young black teenager walked out through the gap in the fence carrying a hard hat and wearing a thick pair of scuffed work boots. He looked to be about 18 years old with grease on his forehead and dirt under his fingernails. He was wiping the sweat from his face with a rough canvas towel. He spotted me standing near the curb with Evelyn. He stopped walking. He recognized me from the orientation seminar we held last month. He stood up a little taller, adjusting his posture, and walked straight over to me. He did not look at the ground. He looked me directly in the eyes with a fierce, burning pride that you can only find in someone who has finally been given a real chance to survive. He reached out his hand. His palm was rough and calloused, covered in plaster dust. I reached out and took his hand. He gripped my hand with a firm, strong shake. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice steady and full of profound respect. He told me he had just finished his first week in the electrical apprenticeship program, and that his mother was finally able to quit her third job because of the stipend the foundation provided. I looked at this young man. I saw the exact same fire in his eyes that I had when I was his age. I saw the desperate hunger to build a life of dignity. I gave him a genuine warm smile. It was the first time I had truly smiled in months. "Do not thank me, son," I replied, my voice low and filled with absolute certainty. "You are the one doing the heavy lifting. You are the one putting in the hours. I am just giving you the tools. Now go out there and just build something they cannot take away." He nodded deeply, absorbing the weight of my words. He turned around and walked proudly down the street, heading home to his family with an honest paycheck in his pocket. I watched him walk away, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of catharsis. The pain of losing my son to greed was still there, but it was slowly being replaced by the incredible joy of saving 100 other sons who actually wanted to be saved. The next morning, the city was quiet. I sat alone at my wooden kitchen table, drinking my usual cup of bitter black coffee. The sun was barely rising, casting long shadows across the floor. I opened the local newspaper, spreading the large printed pages across the table. I skipped the front page and went straight to the public notices section in the back. I scanned the tiny black text until I found exactly what I was looking for. There it was, printed in cold, hard ink for the entire city to see. A notice of public foreclosure auction. The massive luxury estate belonging to Richard and Susan was officially being seized by the federal bank. The illusion of their high society dominance had completely collapsed. The Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection had failed to save their personal assets because the federal tax lien triggered by Malcolm wire fraud had completely consumed their remaining liquidity. They had lost everything. Evelyn had sent me a brief update the night before. Richard and Susan had been evicted from their mansion by federal marshals. They were currently renting a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in the industrial suburbs, miles away from their wealthy friends who now refused to even answer their phone calls. They were drowning in massive legal fees, desperately trying to negotiate plea deals to avoid serving time in a federal penitentiary. And Chloe, the arrogant bride who had ordered me to carry her heavy oak tables, the woman who had laughed about draining my pension to save her father business. Evelyn reported that Chloe had been entirely stripped of her elite status. Her credit cards were frozen. Her socialite friends blocked her on social media. She was currently working a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing store in a strip mall. She spent her days folding cheap shirts and dealing with angry customers, earning just enough money to pay her bus fare. The beautiful designer wedding gown she wore when she thought she had conquered the world was currently sitting in a pawn shop window waiting to be sold to cover her legal retainers. The universe has a very specific way of correcting the scales. I folded the newspaper and pushed it to the edge of the table. I finished my coffee, rinsed the heavy ceramic mug in the sink, and walked out to my garage. The air inside the garage was thick with the familiar, comforting smell of motor oil and old leather. I walked over to my 1998 Chevy pickup truck. The hood was popped open, revealing the complex network of steel pipes and rubber hoses. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from my red metal toolbox and leaned over the engine block. I did not need to fix this old truck. I have millions of dollars sitting in secured corporate trust accounts. I could buy a brand new luxury vehicle every single day of the week and never even notice the money leaving my bank. But I choose to keep this rusted Chevy. I choose to spend my weekend mornings covered in thick black engine grease, twisting bolts and changing spark plugs. I do it because the physical labor keeps my rough hands calloused, and it keeps my mind incredibly sharp. The grease under my fingernails serves as a permanent reminder of exactly where I came from. It reminds me of the freezing Chicago winters when I had to fix broken-down diesel trucks just to keep the heat on in my apartment. It keeps me grounded in reality. When you have immense wealth, it is very easy to lose your grip on who you actually are. It is easy to start believing that you are inherently better than the people sweeping the floors. That is exactly what happened to my son. Malcolm let the illusion of easy money poison his entire brain. He forgot the value of a hard day of physical labor. He thought a clean white tuxedo and a stolen bank account made him a king. I tightened a heavy steel bolt on the engine block, feeling the solid resistance of the metal. The pain in my muscles felt good. It felt honest. It was the complete opposite of the fraudulent, empty life my son had tried to steal. I wiped the thick black grease from my hands using a rough red shop towel. I walked over to the wooden workbench at the back of the garage. Resting on the dusty wood was a framed photograph of my late wife, Vivian. The glass was perfectly clean, free of any dust or grease. I looked at her beautiful face. I looked at her warm, knowing smile. We had started our journey with absolutely nothing but the clothes on our backs and a fierce determination to build a legacy that nobody could ever tear down. I reached out and gently touched the wooden frame. "We did it, Viv," I whispered, my voice echoing softly in the quiet garage. "We stopped the rot before it could eat him whole. We cut the poison out of his life. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but I know you would understand." I closed my eyes and took a deep, steady breath, feeling the absolute profound peace settling into my chest. The war was officially over. People think money buys power. They spend their entire lives chasing paper bills, thinking that a large bank account will force the world to respect them. They are completely wrong. 40 years ago, I sat in a bank wearing a cheap suit and asked for a commercial loan. I was denied by a man who looked exactly like Richard. A man who wore the same navy suit and smiled the exact same condescending smile. Back then, I had to bite my tongue and swallow my pride because I needed to feed my pregnant wife. Today, I am sitting on a real estate empire worth more than this entire country club. I could buy this building, tear it down, and turn it into a parking lot without even checking my bank balance. But I did not yell. I did not pull the money out and throw it in his face. I looked directly into his arrogant eyes and I smiled. A slow, quiet, terrifying smile that he was too blind to understand. "I appreciate your extreme generosity, Richard," I said softly. "I will make absolutely sure I am dressed appropriately for the occasion tomorrow." Richard patted my shoulder hard. "Good man. I knew you would understand. Enjoy the free food, Gordon. Eat as much as you like." Money does not buy power, and it certainly does not buy respect. Money just buys a massive magnifying glass that shows the rest of the world exactly who you truly are deep down in your soul. My son tried to steal my wealth to buy the respect of people who secretly hated his very existence. He traded his family and his dignity for a cheap illusion. So I took the illusion away to teach him the only lesson that actually matters in this brutal world. Respect is not something you can buy with a forged check. Respect is not something you can demand just because you are wearing an expensive suit. Respect is built. It is built brick by brick, with honesty, with sacrifice, and with the sweat of your own brow. I turned off the harsh overhead garage lights, leaving only the soft, natural sunlight filtering through the small, dusty window. I walked out of the garage and closed the heavy door behind me, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the balance in your bank account. Money is simply a tool that magnifies your true character. When you chase the illusion of high society and prioritize greed over loyalty, you will inevitably lose everything that actually matters in life. Respect cannot be forged on a stolen deed, and love cannot be bought with unearned cash. A real legacy is built with honesty, sacrifice, and the sweat of your own brow. You must never trade your roots and your dignity for a seat at a table where you are not truly valued. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to our channel for more powerful life lessons. He walked away adjusting his cuffs, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He truly believed he had just bought my dignity for $500. He thought he had put the poor black man firmly in his place. I reached into my pocket and felt the crisp $100 bills. I did not feel humiliated. I felt a deep, dangerous anticipation. I walked back to my quiet corner and sat down in the shadows. The dinner progressed. I sat in silence and observed the room. Richard was the absolute center of attention. He was laughing loudly, flashing a heavy gold Rolex watch every time he raised his glass. He signaled the waiter with a snap of his fingers and ordered another round of $500 bottles of wine for his table. He was putting on a spectacular show of immense wealth. He talked loudly about his logistics company, about expanding his international operations, and about buying a new summer home in Europe. Chloe sat next to him, absorbing the privilege like a sponge. Malcolm sat beside her, nodding along to every word like an obedient puppy, desperate to be accepted into their golden circle. I watched them feast. I watched them raise their glasses and toast to honesty and family values. It was a beautiful, glittering lie. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen. It was a text message from Evelyn, my corporate lawyer. I opened it under the table. Evelyn had been busy. I had asked her to run a full aggressive financial audit on Richard and Susan, and she had delivered. The message read, "Gordon, I pulled the financial records on Richard Logistics Company. It is a complete and total disaster. He is drowning in massive corporate debt. His company has not turned a single dollar of profit in 3 years. He filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection this afternoon just to stop creditors from seizing his personal assets." I stared at the screen. Richard, the man who just handed me $500 out of pity, was completely and utterly broke. But the message did not end there. Evelyn sent a second text. "It gets better, Gordon. Richard took out a massive high-interest loan of $150,000 just 2 days ago to pay for this extravagant country club wedding. The bank required heavy collateral. Richard used Malcolm as a co-signer. Malcolm provided proof of liquid assets to secure the loan. He used the $300,000 he got from selling the Southside lot. The puzzle pieces snapped together perfectly in my mind. My blood ran cold, but my focus was sharper than a razor. Richard was bankrupt. He was using Malcolm to secure a desperate predatory loan to pay for a wedding he absolutely could not afford. And Malcolm secured that loan using the money he stole from me. I looked across the room at Richard. He was lifting a glass of expensive champagne, toasting to his beautiful daughter. He was funding his extreme arrogance with my stolen money. He was insulting my clothes and my background while living a lifestyle financed by the very land I bought with my late wife 40 years ago. They were not wealthy elites. They were broke, desperate parasites feeding off the hard work of a retired mechanic they openly despised. And Malcolm, my own son. He had handed over his stolen cash to save the fragile ego of a man who looked down on him. He had committed a federal crime just to buy his way into a bankrupt racist family. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I took the 5 crisp $100 bills Richard had given me and folded them neatly. I would not buy a tuxedo with this money. I would use it tomorrow to buy his absolute destruction. I watched Malcolm kiss Chloe on the cheek. I watched Richard order another bottle of wine on credit he could never repay. Let them drink, I thought. Let them eat the fine food and dance under the crystal chandeliers. There was no asking how my morning was going. "Dad, I need you to listen to me and not overreact," Malcolm said. His voice was fast and breathless, carrying that arrogant tone he always used when he knew he was wrong but wanted to sound right. "I sold the Southside lot. I forged your signature on the transfer papers and pushed it through yesterday. I needed the cash for the wedding tomorrow. Chloe parents are paying for the country club and the catering. I could not show up empty-handed and look like some charity case from the ghetto." I held my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. I did not say a single word. Malcolm took my silence for submission. "Look, Dad, it is just an old patch of dirt. You have not done anything with it in decades. I got $300,000 for it from some corporate buyer. That is more money than you have seen in your entire life. Do not make a scene tomorrow. I sent a suit to your house. Just wear it, sit in the back row, and let Chloe family enjoy the day. Let them enjoy their final night of pretending to be kings and queens, because tomorrow the sun would rise. Tomorrow the bank would realize the collateral for their loan was tied directly to an active federal wire fraud investigation. Tomorrow the IRS tax lien attached to the Southside lot would drop like an anvil directly onto Richard and Malcolm. Tomorrow they would realize that the quiet old man sitting in the back corner of the room was the architect of their complete and total downfall. I finished my glass of tap water. I stood up and walked out of the country club. I got back into my 1998 Chevy. The valet looked at me again, but this time I did not give him a tip. I just turned the key, listened to the old engine roar to life, and drove away into the night. The trap was fully set. Tomorrow the hammer would fall. I stood at the marble sink in the men's restroom, letting the cold water run over my rough hands. The heavy bass of the music from the dining hall vibrated through the thick walls. I looked at myself in the gold-rimmed mirror, the old gray suit, the tired eyes. I was playing the part of the defeated old man perfectly. But the quiet moment was abruptly shattered. The heavy wooden door swung open with a violent crash. It was Malcolm, my son. He marched into the restroom, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He turned around and pushed the heavy brass lock on the door. The loud click echoed in the pristine bathroom. We were completely alone. He stood between me and the exit, blocking the door with his body. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car, the tuxedo he bought with the money he stole from my safe. He looked at me with a mixture of rage and profound disgust. "What are you doing, Dad?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the expensive marble tiles. "I asked you to come here and act normal. I asked you to mingle. And what do? You sit in the dark corner like some miserable charity case refusing to speak to anyone. You are embarrassing me in front of Chloe family. You are embarrassing me in front of the city councilman." I turned off the faucet. I reached for a thick white towel and slowly dried my hands. I did not rush. I did not show any intimidation. I simply looked at him through the reflection in the mirror. "I am sitting exactly where you put me, Malcolm," I replied, my voice low and steady. "You told me to stay out of the way. I am staying out of the way." He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Do not play games with me," he hissed. "Richard tried to talk to you and you just stared at him. You are deliberately trying to make me look bad. You are trying to make them think I come from garbage. I worked too hard to get into this family. I will not let your stubborn ghetto pride ruin the biggest weekend of my life." I turned around to face him, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was tired. He was gone. In his place stood a desperate, greedy stranger who hated his own reflection so much that he had to destroy mine. I looked at his expensive shoes and his perfectly styled hair. I remembered working 3 shifts at the auto shop, breathing in exhaust fumes and breaking my knuckles just so I could pay his private school tuition. I did it so he would never have to feel inferior to the rich white kids. But instead of gaining confidence, he only learned to worship their money and despise his own blood. I remained silent, letting his anger fill the room. My silence only made him more furious. He thought I was quiet because I was weak. He thought I was quiet because I was an ignorant old man who did not understand how the modern world worked. He took another step forward, closing the distance between us until he was entirely in my personal space. "Listen to me very carefully," old man Malcolm whispered. His voice was trembling with a dark, vicious energy. "I know you are mad about the South Side lot. I know you noticed the deed is missing. But that land was doing absolutely nothing. You were never going to use it. You were just going to die and leave it to rot. I put it to good use. I secured my future. Chloe parents demanded a lavish wedding, and I delivered." I looked directly into his eyes. "And you forged my signature to do it," I stated calmly. Malcolm sneered. "Do not act high and mighty with me. It is done. The money is in my account. But let me make one thing perfectly clear to you tonight. If you say one single word about that land tomorrow, if you try to complain to Chloe, if you try to talk to Richard or Susan or any of their wealthy friends about what I did, I promise you I will end your life as you know it." I did not blink. I waited for him to reveal the absolute bottom of his soul. "I have already spoken to Dr. Evans." Malcolm continued, his tone dropping into a sinister threat. "He is a very good friend of Richard. He is a highly respected psychiatrist. If you cause a scene at my wedding, I will have Dr. Evans declare you mentally incompetent. I will tell the court that you are suffering from severe dementia and paranoia. I will say you are making up wild stories about stolen land because your mind is failing." He leaned in closer until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "With Dr. Evans providing the medical paperwork, I will be granted full legal guardianship over you. I will take control of your pension. I will take your house. And I will throw you into a state-run nursing home on the worst side of the city. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life locked in a tiny room eating terrible food and sitting in your own filth. No one will ever visit you. No one will ever believe a word you say. Because to the rest of the world, you will just be a crazy old man who lost his mind." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. My own son. The child my late wife Vivian had carried and loved. He was standing in front of me, explicitly threatening to strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my basic human rights, all to cover up a felony theft. He was willing to bury me alive in a psychiatric ward just to protect a wedding paid for with stolen cash. In that exact second, something profound happened inside my chest. The last lingering shred of fatherly love, the instinct that always made me want to protect him and guide him, completely withered and died. It turned to ash and blew away. The warm, forgiving father who had tolerated his arrogance for years ceased to exist. In his place, the ruthless, calculated businessman who had built a silent, multi-million-dollar empire from the dirt up fully awakened. I did not shout. I did not strike him. I simply looked at him with an emptiness so cold that I saw him involuntarily take a half-step back. "I understand you perfectly, Malcolm," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have made your intentions absolutely clear. I will not cause a scene tonight." Malcolm relaxed his shoulders, a smug smile creeping back onto his face. "Good," he said. "I am glad we understand each other. Just go back out there, sit at your table, and keep your mouth shut." He turned around, unlocked the heavy brass door, and walked out back into the glittering ballroom to rejoin his wealthy future in-laws. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied an old mechanic into submission. I walked out of the restroom a few moments later. I did not return to my table. I walked straight out the front doors of the country club. I handed my ticket to the valet, got into my 1998 Chevy, and drove away into the freezing night. The city lights blurred past my windshield, but my mind was a machine operating with absolute terrifying precision. It was 11 o'clock at night, but I knew my lawyer would be awake. I drove downtown to the financial district. I parked outside a sleek high-rise building and took the private elevator up to the 40th floor. Evelyn was waiting for me in her massive corner office. The city skyline stretched out behind her, glowing in the dark. Documents were spread across her large glass desk. "Gordon," she said, standing up as I entered. "You look like a man who just attended a funeral." I sat down in the chair opposite her. "I just attended the death of my son, Evelyn," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "He just threatened to declare me legally incompetent and lock me in a state asylum if I expose his theft. He plans to steal my pension and my home." Evelyn stopped moving. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set with a fierce protective anger. "What are your orders, Gordon?" she asked. "Trigger the tax lien," I commanded. "Bring down the entire hammer. Do not hold anything back." Evelyn nodded, pulling a thick red folder from her desk. "Let us review the mechanism," she said, her fingers tracing the legal documents. "When you originally purchased the South Side lot, you placed it under the Apex Holdings corporate umbrella. 5 years ago, we deliberately attached a massive federal tax lien to that specific property. We used it as a corporate shield, a strategic debt placeholder to offset taxes from your other commercial developments. The land carries a deliberate $500,000 IRS liability." I nodded, listening to the beautiful lethal trap I had designed years ago. "Because Malcolm forged the quitclaim deed," Evelyn continued, "and because he rushed the sale through that shady online escrow service, he bypassed the standard title search. He did not realize that the land came with the debt." "Do not embarrass me." He hung up. Just like that. 45 years of raising him, of breaking my back so he could walk around in tailored suits, and he dismissed me in less than 2 minutes. I set my coffee cup down. I walked slowly down the hallway to my home office. My joints ached a little, a reminder of the decades I spent crawling under cars as a mechanic and hauling bricks as a contractor. I opened the heavy steel safe tucked behind my bookshelf. I reached for the thick blue folder where I kept the physical deeds to my oldest properties. I flipped it open. The deed for the South Side lot was gone. He actually did it. My own flesh and blood crept into my home, opened my safe with the combination he memorized when he was a teenager and stole from me. I sat down in my leather chair and looked at a framed photograph on my desk. It was a picture of me and my late wife Vivian, taken 40 years ago. We were standing on that exact South Side lot. By transferring the property into his name to sell it to Apex Holdings, he legally assumed the encumbrance. And because Richard used his logistics company to underwrite the fast cash loan using that specific transaction as collateral, Richard is now a co-guarantor on the debt. Evelyn looked up from the papers, a predatory smile on her face. "Gordon, as of yesterday afternoon, your son and his arrogant future father-in-law do not just owe a bank $150,000. They legally owe the Internal Revenue Service $500,000 in immediate federal back taxes. They are jointly liable." The moment we notify the IRS of the transfer, their bank accounts will be completely frozen. Do it, I said. File the notification immediately. I want the federal system to process it by dawn. I want the debt locked onto their social security numbers before they even put on their wedding suits. It will be done, Gordon Evelyn said, typing rapidly on her keyboard. They tried to bury you in a nursing home. We are going to bury them in federal court. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city I had quietly conquered. Tomorrow was the wedding day. Malcolm wanted a spectacular, unforgettable event. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. I would sit in the back row. I would watch him smile, and then I would burn his entire fake world to ashes. That morning my son called and casually mentioned he had forged my signature to sell my property so he could pay for his lavish wedding. He told me to sit quietly in the back and not embarrass him. I did not scream. I did not cry. A smile was all I gave. Because what my son did not know was that the anonymous company he illegally sold my land to was actually owned by me. When his wedding day came, I did not just bring a gift. I brought the FBI. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not bought with stolen money. The morning of the wedding arrived with a pale gray sky. I was already awake long before the sun came up. I sat in my kitchen drinking my black coffee just like the day before. But today felt different. Today was the day of reckoning. The federal tax trap had been officially triggered during the night. The machinery of justice was already in motion, grinding silently in the background. I was just waiting for the grand finale. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated on the wooden table. I looked at the screen. It was Chloe, my future daughter-in-law. Most brides on the morning of their wedding are surrounded by bridesmaids drinking mimosas and crying tears of joy. If they call their future father-in-law, it is usually to say how excited they are to join the family. But not Chloe. I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. There was no warm greeting. There was no joy in her voice. "Gordon," she said, her voice sharp and breathless, "I need you to get down to the venue right now. We have a massive crisis." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "What kind of crisis?" Chloe, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "The catering company messed up the schedule," she snapped. "Half their staff called in sick and they do not have enough people to set up the main ballroom. The tables are still stacked in the delivery bay. Richard is furious and I am about to have a panic attack. I need you to come down here and help them move the furniture. We need heavy lifting done and Malcolm is busy getting a massage with his groomsmen." I sat there listening to the absolute audacity of this young woman. She was marrying my son in a few hours. She was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on ice sculptures and imported flowers. But when it came to physical labor, when it came to sweating and hauling heavy oak tables, she immediately thought of the old black man from the South Side. To her, I was not family. I was unpaid manual labor. I was the errand boy. Any normal father would have been insulted. Any normal man would have yelled at her for the disrespect. But I was not a normal man, and today was not a normal day. I smiled into the phone. Her arrogance was giving me the perfect excuse to walk right into the center of their operation without raising any suspicion. "I will be right there, Chloe," I said smoothly. "Do not worry about a thing. I will take care of the heavy lifting." She did not say thank you. She just sighed loudly and hung up the phone. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and put on my work boots. I drove my old Chevy truck up the winding paved road leading to the grand estate where the wedding was being held. It was a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a massive stone mansion. I parked near the service entrance, avoiding the pristine valet circle at the front. I walked into the grand ballroom through the kitchen doors. The room was a chaotic mess of half-finished decorations. Massive circular oak tables were stacked near the back doors. I did not complain. I rolled up the sleeves of my faded button-down shirt and got to work. I have hauled concrete and steel for 40 years. A few wooden tables were nothing to me. I hoisted the first heavy table onto my shoulder and carried it across the marble floor, setting it down perfectly in its designated spot. I went back for the second, the third, the fourth. Sweat began to bead on my forehead, but I kept my breathing steady. I was carrying the sixth table across the room when I heard the sharp clicking of expensive heels striking the marble floor. I set the table down and wiped my brow. Susan Chloe Mother was marching across the room holding a clipboard and a crystal glass of champagne. She wore a tailored silk pantsuit and a scowl that could freeze water. She stopped right in front of me. She did not recognize the man who had sat quietly in the corner at her rehearsal dinner the night before. To her, I was just another anonymous worker in worn-out clothes. "Excuse me," Susan barked, snapping her manicured fingers in my direction. "What do you think you are doing? You are dragging those table legs and scuffing the imported marble. Pick them up higher. Do you have any idea how much this venue costs? If you damage this floor, I will make sure your catering company docks it from your minimum wage paycheck." I stood up straight, adjusting my posture. I looked down at her. "I am lifting them just fine, ma am I," said my voice deep and rumbling. "There are no scuffs on your floor. Do not talk back to me." Susan hissed, her face turning red. "I want to speak to your manager right now. You people always try to cut corners when you think nobody is watching." Before I could reply, a voice echoed from the doorway. "Susan, wait! Stop!" Malcolm came jogging into the ballroom. He was wearing silk pajamas and holding a cup of espresso. He looked absolutely horrified. He rushed over and stood between me and his future mother-in-law. "Susan, this is not a worker," Malcolm said, his voice trembling with deep embarrassment. "This is Gordon. This is my father." Susan froze. The arrogant fire in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a shocking, awkward horror. She looked at my work boots, my rolled-up sleeves, and my sweating face. She looked at Malcolm and then back to me. "Oh my goodness," Susan stammered, taking a step back. "Gordon, I am so terribly sorry. I completely thought you were one of the hired hands. You are just dressed so casually and you were doing all this heavy lifting. I had no idea." It was a fake apology wrapped in another insult. She was still judging my clothes and my presence. "Do not apologize, Susan," I said, flashing a cold, polite smile. "Chloe called and ordered me to come do the heavy lifting. I am just making sure your daughter gets the perfect day she paid for. With my son money, of course." Malcolm's face turned pale. He grabbed my arm and pulled me away from Susan. "Dad, what are you doing here acting like a janitor?" Malcolm hissed under his breath. "I told you not to embarrass me. Why are you sweating and hauling tables? Go wash your face and wait in the back room." I pulled my arm out of his grip. I brushed the dust off my shirt. "I am just doing what your bride commanded, Malcolm. I will be out of your way shortly." I walked away from him and headed down the long, ornate hallway toward the back rooms to wash my hands. The hallway was lined with private suites for the bridal party. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my heavy work boots. I was carrying a small cardboard box of floral centerpieces they had asked me to move out of the way. As I passed the largest suite at the end of the hall, I noticed the heavy wooden door was cracked open just a few inches. I could hear voices drifting out from inside. It was Chloe and her mother Susan. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the hallway listening. Susan was pacing back and forth. I can hear her heels digging into the floor. "I cannot believe I just yelled at your future father-in-law," she complained. It was mortifying, Chloe. "Why did you not tell me he was coming early to do manual labor? He looks like a homeless man wandering around our beautiful venue." I heard Chloe sigh loudly. "Do not worry about the old man, Mom," Chloe said dismissively. "He is clueless. He is just happy to be included. I told him to move tables so he would stay out of our way and feel useful." I tightened my grip on the cardboard box. The sheer venom in her voice was staggering. "Malcolm thought it was just worthless dirt. He thought I was just a retired mechanic scraping by on a meager pension. He was ashamed of my rough hands and my old car. He was so desperate to impress Chloe and her wealthy white parents that he never bothered to ask about his own history. Vivian and I bought that Southside dirt 4 decades ago. Back then, the banks in Chicago would not look twice at a young black man wanting a commercial loan. They drew red lines around our neighborhoods and locked us out. So Vivian and I saved every single penny. I worked 3 shifts. She worked 2. We bought that land with pure cash. It was the very first piece of an empire I built quietly over the years. I chose to stay invisible. Visible wealth attracts problems. Invisible wealth brings true power. I built a massive real estate portfolio through anonymous shell companies and corporate trusts. Malcolm never knew. I wanted him to learn the value of hard work. But it was Susan's next words that truly revealed the depth of their depravity. "Well, thank God Malcolm finally got his hands on that cash," Susan said, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide the malicious relief. "Your father was having a heart attack last night over the logistics company. We were a week away from total bankruptcy. That $300,000 Malcolm pulled from nowhere saved our lives today. I know, Mom, Chloe replied, letting out a cruel, calculating laugh. Malcolm is desperate to please us. He is an idiot, but he is a useful idiot. Once we are married, his finances are my finances. And once his old man finally kicks the bucket, we will drain whatever miserable pension he has left to keep Dad business afloat. This is not just a marriage, Mom. It is a hostile takeover. I stopped breathing for a second. The cold reality of their words settled into my bones. This was not just a case of an arrogant family looking down on me. This was a calculated financial execution. Chloe did not love my son. She despised him. She saw him as a weak, insecure target she could manipulate to steal his resources. They were planning to bleed him dry and then come after me to finish the job. They were predators. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger is an unpredictable emotion. What I felt was absolute clarity. I set the cardboard box down on a small side table without making a sound. I turned around and walked back down the hallway, leaving the bridal suite behind me. I walked out the back doors of the grand estate and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts until I found the name I needed. Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit. I had met him years ago when I helped the Bureau untangle a corrupt city zoning contract. He knew who I was. He knew my real net worth. And he knew I never called unless I had a bulletproof case. I typed out a message with steady, precise fingers. Agent Miller, the wire fraud evidence I sent you last night is confirmed. The primary suspect and the CO conspirators are all gathered in one location. I need your team at the Oakmont estate tonight at exactly 7 o'clock. Bring the federal warrants. Bring the handcuffs. Do not use the sirens until you reach the main gates. I hit send. The message delivered instantly. I looked up at the massive stone mansion. Inside, my son was putting on a tuxedo bought with stolen money, preparing to marry a woman who viewed him as a walking bank account. They were about to have the most expensive, beautiful wedding this city had ever seen. I smiled and put my phone back in my pocket. I was going to let them have their beautiful ceremony. I was going to let them eat their caviar and drink their champagne. I would sit quietly in the back row just like they asked. And then, when the toasts were made and the room was full of their wealthy friends, I was going to lock the doors and watch the federal government tear their entire world to shreds. That morning my son called and casually mentioned he had forged my signature to sell my property so he could pay for his lavish wedding. He told me to sit quietly in the back and not embarrass him. I did not scream. I did not cry. A smile was all I gave. Because what my son did not know was that the anonymous company he illegally sold my land to was actually owned by me. When his wedding day came, I did not just bring a gift. I brought the FBI. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not bought with stolen money. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns of the Oakmont estate. The ceremony was set up on the grand terrace overlooking a private lake. Rows of pristine white wooden chairs were perfectly aligned, separated by an aisle covered in thick white rose petals. The aesthetic was suffocatingly white and gold. It was a visual representation of the world my son so desperately wanted to buy his way into. A world that was currently being funded by the $300,000 he stole from my safe. I took my assigned seat. They did not put me in the front row where the father of the groom belongs. They did not put me in the second row or the third. My name card was placed in the very last row at the extreme edge of the seating arrangement. I was sitting so far back that my chair was practically touching the velvet rope separating the guests from the catering staff. Two young waiters holding silver trays of water glasses stood just a few feet away from me. One of them gave me a sympathetic look. He saw my faded gray suit and probably assumed I was an old uncle who had been invited out of mere obligation. I gave him a polite nod, but my focus remained locked on the altar. Soft, classical music began to play from a string quartet positioned near the water. The heavy wooden doors of the mansion opened and the groomsmen began to walk down the aisle. Then came Malcolm, my son, the boy I had taught to tie his shoes and throw a baseball. He was wearing a custom-tailored white tuxedo with gold accents. He looked like a prince from a fairy tale, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders were stiff, his smile was tight and rehearsed. He was scanning the front rows, looking at Chloe and her wealthy family, seeking their approval with every step he took. As he walked down the long aisle, he turned his head and looked toward the back of the crowd. For one brief second, his eyes met mine. I was the man who had worked 3 shifts a day repairing diesel engines so he would not have to take out student loans. I was the man who buried his mother and raised him alone. But in that moment, Malcolm did not see his father. He saw a liability. He saw a secret he needed to keep hidden. His eyes darted away instantly. He looked right through me and turned his attention back to the altar. He refused to acknowledge my existence in front of his new high society family. I sat perfectly still. I did not shift in my seat. I just watched him take his place at the front of the crowd, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was already crumbling. The music swelled and the guests stood up. Chloe walked down the aisle, holding her father by the arm. Richard looked incredibly smug, walking his daughter down the petal-covered path. He was wearing a grin that said he owned the world. He had absolutely no idea that his logistics company was currently bleeding out in bankruptcy court, or that he had just anchored his entire financial future to a massive federal tax debt. He handed Chloe over to Malcolm with a firm pat on my son's shoulder, a pat bought and paid for with my stolen land. The officiant stepped forward and began to speak. He spoke about the sanctity of marriage. He talked about how a strong relationship must be built on a foundation of absolute honesty and unwavering trust. I sat in the back row doing the mental math of their impending destruction. Honesty and trust. The words echoed over the quiet lake. Malcolm was standing there pretending to be a self-made success story while actively hiding a federal wire fraud felony. Chloe was standing there pretending to be a loving bride while I knew for a fact she was plotting to drain my pension the moment I died to save her father business. It was not a wedding ceremony. It was a theater of illusions where every participant was actively scamming the other. It was time for the vows. Malcolm took Chloe by her hands. He looked deeply into her eyes and spoke into the microphone. He said that he promised to always be her protector. He said he promised to build an empire with her from the ground up based on truth and partnership. I listened to my son speak those words and I felt a cold chill run through my veins. Build an empire. He had no idea what building an empire actually required. He thought building an empire meant forging a signature on a quitclaim deed and stealing $300,000 from an old man's safe. He thought an empire was built on expensive champagne and custom white tuxedos. As he spoke, I calculated the exact timeline of his ruin. 15 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud. $500,000 in immediate tax liabilities to the Internal Revenue Service. The total seizure of all his bank accounts. I watched him make his grand promises, knowing that by sunset tonight he would not even have the money to buy a cup of coffee. Chloe spoke next. She smiled perfectly for the cameras and promised to stand by Malcolm in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty. I remembered the vicious laughter I had overheard in the bridal suite just hours earlier. I remembered her telling her mother that Malcolm was a useful idiot. I wondered how long her promise of staying through poverty would actually last once the federal agents walked through the doors of this estate. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Malcolm and Chloe kissed. The wealthy crowd erupted into polite applause. The string quartet played a joyful melody. I remained seated in the back row watching the two conspirators seal their fate. They had officially tied their lives, their debts, and their crimes together. The ceremony concluded, and the guests began to transition toward the grand terrace for the cocktail hour. Waiters circulated with silver trays of expensive appetizers and crystal glasses of champagne. I wanted him to build his own life without waiting for a handout. Instead, he grew up resenting my simplicity. He chased the illusion of high society and let a woman like Chloe convince him that his own father was a burden. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Evelyn answered on the second ring. Evelyn was my corporate lawyer, a brilliant and ruthless black woman who managed the legal side of my entire empire. "Evelyn, wake up," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "My son just robbed me." I heard the rustle of sheets and the immediate clicking of a keyboard on her end. Evelyn never wasted time with pleasantries when there was a crisis. "Give me the details, Gordon," she said. "Malcolm forged a quitclaim deed for the South Side lot," I explained. "He pushed a sale through yesterday for $300,000. Find out who the buyer is and how he cleared the funds so fast." The line went quiet except for the frantic typing. The wedding party was instructed to stay near the altar for formal family portraits. I stood up from my chair in the back row. I smoothed the lapels of my faded gray suit, and walked slowly down the aisle, stepping over the crushed white rose petals. The photographer was a professional, hired to capture the perfect upper-class aesthetic. He was busy organizing the bridesmaids and groomsmen, giving them precise directions. He finished taking photos of Chloe with her parents Richard and Susan. Then he called for the groom family. He looked around the immediate area, expecting to see a polished, wealthy couple step forward. He called out, asking for the father of the groom to please join Malcolm on the altar for the traditional father and son portrait. I stepped forward out of the shadows of the departing crowd. I walked toward my son, but before I could even reach the first step of the altar, Richard physically moved to block my path. He stepped right in front of me, using his broad shoulders to cut me off from the photographer line of sight. Richard held up his hand, stopping me in my tracks. His face was a mask of polite hostility. He leaned in close so only I could hear him. "No, Gordon," Richard said smoothly, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "I think we are just going to stick to the core family for this particular set of photos. The aesthetic for the album is strictly white and gold. We have a very specific vision for the publication, and we just want to keep the visuals consistent." He was telling me that my cheap suit, my dark skin, and my working-class presence did not fit into their high society magazine spread. He was erasing me from the visual history of my own son's wedding. I did not argue with Richard. I simply looked past his shoulder at Malcolm. My son was standing just a few feet away. He heard every single word Richard said. All Malcolm had to do was speak up. All he had to do was say that I was his father and that I belonged in the photograph. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to show one tiny shred of the integrity his mother and I had tried to teach him. Malcolm looked at me. His eyes were full of cowardice. He looked down at his expensive white shoes, refusing to meet my gaze. He remained completely silent. He let Richard push his father out of the frame. That silence was the final lock clicking into place. I nodded slowly. "I understand perfectly, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I would not want to ruin your beautiful aesthetic." I turned my back on my son and walked away from the altar. I walked across the terrace, heading straight for the massive doors of the reception hall. The cocktail hour was in full swing, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital clock on my phone. The federal agents were staging at the perimeter. The tax trap was completely locked in. My son had made his choice. He wanted to play the part of a rich man in a world built on lies. The trap was fully primed. I walked into the reception hall, ready to pull the trigger. The grand reception hall of the Oakmont estate was a monument to financial recklessness. As I walked through the towering oak doors, I was immediately hit by the sheer scale of the waste. They had transformed the historic ballroom into an absurd spectacle of white and gold. It was a $150,000 masterpiece of absolute garbage. Crystal chandeliers had been lowered just to drape them in imported white orchids. In the center of the room, massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans were slowly melting into silver basins. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and truffles. A massive champagne tower stood near the dance floor, shimmering under the warm, expensive lighting. Every single detail was designed to scream wealth. But to me, it just screamed debt. I knew exactly how this party was being funded. Every bite of caviar, every drop of champagne, and every wilting orchid was paid for by the $300,000 my son stole from my safe. It was my money fueling this ridiculous illusion. They did not seat me at the head table. They did not even seat me with the extended family. My assigned seat was at a small, wobbly table pushed all the way to the back of the room, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I was seated with the venue coordinators and a few off-duty staff members who looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. I did not mind. Being in the back gave me the perfect vantage point. A predator always prefers to watch the entire room. When the dinner service began, the waiters brought out plates of filet mignon and butter-poached lobster for the wealthy guests at the front. When they reached my table, the waiter apologetically handed me a plate of dry, overcooked chicken and a scoop of cold potatoes. It was a deliberate instruction from the bride, a final petty insult to remind the old man from the South Side exactly where he stood in their hierarchy. I did not complain. I picked up my silver fork and I ate my dry chicken quietly. I chewed each bite with slow, deliberate precision. I watched the room. I watched the wealthy elites laugh and drink and congratulate themselves on their incredible success. I watched my son Malcolm sit at the sweetheart table looking like a nervous imposter in his white tuxedo, trying desperately to mirror the elegant posture of his new wife. He was drowning in a sea of fake friends and predatory in-laws, but he was smiling as if he had just conquered the world. I took a sip of tap water and glanced at the wall clock. The federal agents were currently moving into position outside the estate gates. The clock was ticking. Let them eat, I thought to myself. Let them enjoy the most expensive meal of their lives, because tomorrow they will be eating off plastic trays in a federal holding cell. The heavy clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass echoed through the massive ballroom. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd slowly died down as Richard stood up at the head table. He adjusted the lapels of his custom navy suit and grabbed the wireless microphone. His face was flushed red from several glasses of expensive wine. He looked out over the crowd of city councilmen, corporate executives, and high society socialites with a sickeningly arrogant grin. He truly believed he was the king of the world. He had no idea that his logistics company was currently dead in the water and his personal bank accounts were locked under a federal tax lien. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice booming through the surround sound speakers. "Tonight, we are celebrating the union of two incredible people. But mostly we are celebrating the success and the immense generosity of this family." He paused to let his friends chuckle and applaud. He paced across the dance floor, holding the microphone like a stand-up comedian. He spent the next 5 minutes doing nothing but boasting about his own fabricated wealth. He talked about his international business ventures, his summer homes, and the massive check he supposedly wrote to make this beautiful wedding happen. He was standing on my property, bragging about spending my stolen money. Then Richard turned his attention to my son. He walked over and placed a heavy, patronizing hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "When Chloe first brought Malcolm home, I have to admit I was a little surprised," Richard said, his voice taking on a mock-serious tone. "We all know Malcolm comes from a very different background than we do. He did not grow up with the same privileges. He came from the rough side of town, from the streets of the South Side." I stopped chewing my food. I placed my fork down on the white tablecloth. "But I saw potential in the boy," Richard continued, grinning broadly. "I decided to take Malcolm under my wing. I decided to teach him how the real world works. I taught him how to dress, how to speak, and how to conduct himself in polite society. I rescued him from that environment. And look at him now. He is polished. He is successful. I like to think I made him one of the good ones." The room erupted into polite applause and soft laughter. It was a blatant, thinly veiled racist joke. It was a disgusting microaggression disguised as a compliment. Richard was publicly calling my son a charity case, a street thug that the wealthy white savior had to tame and civilize. I looked at Malcolm, waiting for him to react. I waited for the son of Vivian Mitchell to stand up and defend his blood. I waited for him to defend the neighborhood that raised him and the father who broke his back to feed him. Malcolm did nothing. He just sat there looking down at his plate and forced a weak, humiliating smile. He actually nodded and laughed along with the crowd that was currently mocking his entire existence. My son had sold his soul for a seat at a table where he would only ever be a punchline. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over my entire body. I checked my pocket to ensure the $500 Richard had given me was still there. The time for waiting was almost over. Richard finished his arrogant speech and the ballroom echoed with another round of enthusiastic applause. He handed the microphone over to his daughter. Chloe stood up, smoothing the front of her designer wedding gown. She looked radiant and beautiful, but her eyes held a sharp, calculating cruelty that matched her father perfectly. She smiled for the photographer cameras, making sure the lighting caught the diamonds around her neck. "Thank you, Daddy," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I could picture Evelyn staring at her multiple glowing monitors. "Gordon," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "He used a shady online escrow service to bypass the standard waiting period. The county clerk filed the transfer yesterday afternoon. But Gordon, you are going to want to hear who he sold it to." "Tell me," I said. "He sold it to a commercial developer called Apex Holdings. They paid cash." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The sheer poetic irony of the situation washed over me. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Vivian's photograph again. "Evelyn," I murmured. "Tell me you are seeing what I am seeing." "I am seeing it, Gordon," she replied, her tone laced with absolute disbelief. "Apex Holdings is one of our Tier 3 shell companies. We use it to acquire commercial zoning permits in the South District. Your son stole your land and sold it to your own company. My own son, trying to play the high roller, had fallen blindly into his own trap. And thank you to everyone who flew in to be with us tonight. This is truly a magical evening. Malcolm and I are so blessed to have such an incredible supportive network of successful friends and family. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the massive room. She looked at the city officials, the business partners, and the wealthy socialites. Then her eyes drifted all the way to the back of the hall. She locked eyes with me. I was sitting alone at the tiny, wobbly table next to the kitchen doors. And of course, Chloe continued raising her voice so the microphone carried her words into every corner of the estate. We want to take a special moment to thank Malcolm Dad for showing up tonight. The entire room turned around to look at me, hundreds of eyes scanning the shadows at the back of the room trying to spot the poor old man from the slums. We know it was a long drive for you, Chloe said, her smile widening into a vicious smirk. And we know that places like this, being around so much elegance and high society, can be very overwhelming for you. We just hope you are enjoying the free meal. A wave of soft, condescending laughter rippled through the ballroom. Rich women in silk dresses covered their mouths to hide their chuckles. Men in expensive tuxedos shook their heads with amusement. They were looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity and mockery. They saw an uneducated, exhausted old mechanic who was probably terrified of the crystal glasses and the fancy silverware. I looked at Chloe. She was glowing with the satisfaction of having publicly humiliated her new father-in-law. She thought she had put the final nail in the coffin of my dignity. She thought she had established absolute dominance over her new husband-family line. Malcolm stared at the table, refusing to look back at me. He was too cowardly to stop his wife from treating his father like a zoo animal. I did not shrink down into my chair. I did not look away in shame. I sat perfectly still under the weight of 300 mocking stares. I reached for my glass of tap water and took one final slow sip. I set the glass down gently so it did not make a single sound. I picked up the pristine white linen napkin from my lap. I folded it with absolute precision edge to edge and calmly wiped my mouth. I placed the napkin on the table next to my plate of dry chicken. I placed both hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. The scraping sound of the wooden chair legs against the marble floor echoed loudly, cutting through the dying chuckles of the crowd. I stood up. I straightened my back, rising to my full height of 6'2". I buttoned the front of my faded gray suit jacket. I stepped away from the shadows of the kitchen doors and turned my body toward the illuminated stage. The chuckles in the room suddenly stopped. The silence became thick and heavy. I did not say a word. I just started walking. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping sound echoed through the silent ballroom. 300 guests stared at me. They expected me to lower my head and walk out the back doors in shame. They expected the old black man in the faded gray suit to retreat to his broken truck and disappear into the night. But I did not walk to the exit. I turned my body and started walking straight down the center aisle toward the illuminated stage. My boots hit the imported marble floor with a heavy rhythmic thud. Step by step, I moved past the tables of wealthy corporate executives and city councilmen. The polite chuckles that had filled the room completely died away. The silence became suffocating. The guests shifted in their seats uncomfortably. They watched me march forward with a cold, focused intensity that they could not understand. I was 75 years old, but my back was perfectly straight. I am 6 feet and 2 inches tall, and my shoulders carry the weight of 40 years of hauling steel and concrete. I did not look like a frail old man anymore. I looked like a reckoning. Up on the stage, the smug smile on Chloe's face began to falter. She gripped the microphone tightly. She looked at her father, Richard. Richard's face turned red with sudden anger. He thought I was coming up to make a drunken fool of myself. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers, signaling the private security guards standing near the champagne tower. A massive security guard in a black suit stepped into the center aisle, blocking my path. He held up his hand, telling me to stop and return to my seat. I did not slow my pace. I walked right up to him, stopping mere inches from his chest. I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not say a single word. I just let him see the absolute frozen violence in my stare. The guard swallowed hard. He looked at my rough, calloused hands and the unblinking focus in my eyes. He realized instantly that he was not dealing with a confused elderly guest. He slowly lowered his hand and took a step back, letting me pass. Richard stood up from his chair, panic flashing across his face. But it was too late. I walked up the short flight of carpeted stairs and stepped onto the main stage. I walked right up to Chloe. She froze, completely paralyzed by my presence. I reached out and gently but with unstoppable force took the wireless microphone right out of her trembling hand. I stood at the center of the stage. I looked out over the sea of expensive suits and diamond necklaces. 300 of the most powerful people in the city were holding their breath waiting for me to speak. But I did not address the crowd. I turned my back to the audience and walked directly over to the head table where Richard was standing. Richard tried to puff out his chest, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Gordon," he whispered through gritted teeth, his face flushed with rage. "Put the microphone down right now. You are embarrassing yourself. You are ruining my daughter's wedding. I will have you thrown out into the street." I did not respond to his threats. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my old gray suit jacket. I pulled out the neatly folded stack of 5 crisp $100 bills. The exact same bills Richard had slipped into my pocket the night before when he told me to buy a decent tuxedo so I would not look like I came from the slums. I held the cash up so the guests in the front rows could see it. Then I stepped right up to Richard's place setting. He had a crystal flute filled with $500 champagne sitting next to his plate. I held my hand over his glass. I let go of the bills. The $500 fluttered down and landed right inside his champagne, soaking in the expensive alcohol. I lifted the microphone to my mouth. My voice boomed through the massive surround sound speakers echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Richard," I said, my tone perfectly calm, but laced with absolute authority, "I want you to keep your charity. You are going to need every single penny of that $500 to pay your bankruptcy lawyers." The entire ballroom gasped collectively. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. I saw corporate executives leaning in, whispering frantically to each other. Richard's face drained of all its color. He went from flush red to a sickly ghost, white, in less than a second. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I stepped closer to him, making sure the microphone picked up every syllable. "You stood up here tonight bragging about your international business and your massive wealth," I continued, relentlessly. "You made jokes about rescuing my son from the streets. But the truth is, your logistics company has not made a profit in 3 years. You are drowning in corporate debt. You officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection yesterday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. "Is that not right, Richard?" Susan dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The illusion of their high society dominance shattered into a million pieces right in front of their wealthy friends. Richard staggered back, hitting the edge of the table. He looked like a man who had just been shot. He knew I had completely exposed him, but I was not finished. I had only just started tearing their fake empire to the ground. I turned away from Richard, leaving him trembling in his ruined pride. I walked slowly down the length of the head table toward the sweetheart section. I stopped right in front of my son. Malcolm was sitting there in his pristine white tuxedo. He looked absolutely terrified. The arrogant groom who had dismissed me on the phone just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In his place sat a scared, desperate boy who finally realized he had played a very dangerous game with the wrong man. I stared down at him, my own flesh and blood, the son I had sacrificed my youth to protect. "You sat there and let them mock me, Malcolm," I said, my voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a cold, heavy disappointment. "You let them insult the neighborhood that raised you. You let them humiliate the father who broke his back to feed you. And you did it all to impress a bankrupt family using money you stole from my safe." Malcolm gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. "Dad," he whispered, leaning toward the microphone, his voice cracking with panic. "Dad, stop, please. Do not do this here. We can talk about this at home. Please." I did not blink. I did not soften my gaze. "There is no home for you anymore, Malcolm," I announced to the entire room. "You crept into my office like a common thief. You forged my signature on a legal quitclaim deed." He was so desperate for fast cash that he took the first anonymous corporate offer he could find without doing a single background check. "What is his legal exposure, Evelyn?" I asked. I wanted to hear the exact parameters of the grave my son had just dug for himself. Evelyn cleared her throat. Her lawyer persona took over completely. "Gordon, he forged your signature on a legal property transfer. He used a digital network to initiate a fraudulent sale and accepted $300,000 across state lines. That is federal wire fraud. It is identity theft. It is grand larceny. He is looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." I closed my eyes. A heavy sorrow mixed with a burning resolve. For years I had watched Malcolm bend over backward to please Chloe and her arrogant parents, Richard and Susan. I watched him accept their subtle racist jokes, their condescending remarks about our background, and their endless demands for money. You sold the Southside lot, the land your mother and I bought 40 years ago with cash we bled for. You sold it for $300,000 just so you could pay for this extravagant wedding and buy your way into this fraudulent family. The guests were completely silent now. Nobody was recording on their phones anymore. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from scandalous gossip to the terrifying reality of witnessing a federal crime being confessed out loud. You thought you were so smart? I continued, my voice relentless and sharp. You thought you hustled an old, clueless mechanic who did not understand how the modern world works. You thought you could just push a fraudulent sale through an online escrow service and I would be too stupid to notice. Malcolm was shaking uncontrollably now. Tears welled up in his eyes. He looked around the room, realizing that every single person he had tried to impress was now looking at him like he was a criminal. But you were in such a desperate hurry to get the cash, I said, leaning in so close I could see the sweat dripping down his forehead. You were so eager to please Chloe and her broke father that you took the very first corporate cash offer you received. You sold my land to a shell company, a commercial developer called Apex Holdings. I paused, letting the name of the company hang in the dead silence of the ballroom. I watched Malcolm's eyes dart back and forth as his brain tried to catch up to the trap he had walked into. Tell me something, son, I asked, my tone dropping to a whisper that echoed like thunder through the speakers. When you signed those fraudulent transfer papers, when you accepted the wire transfer for $300,000 across state lines, did you even bother to look at the name of the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings on the receipt? Malcolm stared at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He slowly shook his head no. I smiled, a cold, devastating smile. Apex Holdings is my company, Malcolm. You stole my land and you sold it back to me. The color vanished from Malcolm's face. His jaw dropped open. He finally realized the absolute magnitude of the mistake he had made. He had not outsmarted a retired mechanic. He had just handed a multi-million-dollar corporate entity all the evidence it needed to bury him in federal prison. And the executioner holding the microphone was his own father. I stood on that stage looking out at the 300 guests. They were all completely silent now. The music had stopped. The clinking of glasses had stopped. There was only the sound of my voice echoing through the massive speakers. I looked directly at Malcolm. He was staring at me with a blank expression of pure terror. Apex Holdings is my company, I said, clearly and slowly, so every single person in the room could understand the magnitude of his mistake. You stole my land, Malcolm. You forged my signature to steal the Southside lot, and then you turned around and sold it right back to me. That is not just a family dispute. That is federal wire fraud, son. I watched the realization hit him. The arrogant groom who had threatened to lock me in a nursing home just a few hours ago was suddenly gone. His knees buckled under his tailored white suit. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the sweetheart table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the marble floor. He was gasping for air like a man who was drowning. The wealthy guests started shifting in their seats. They were no longer looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him like he was a criminal. He had wanted to impress them so badly. He had wanted to buy their respect with a $300,000 wedding. But respect is not something you can buy with stolen money. I let the silence hang in the air. I let him feel the absolute weight of his actions. You thought you could erase me? I continued, my voice steady and cold. You thought you could erase the sacrifices your mother and I made. That land was bought with cash my wife and I saved by working multiple shifts. We bled for that property. You sold 40 years of our history for a party. You thought I would just sit in the back row and let you get away with it. You thought my silence was weakness, but my silence was just me waiting for the ink to dry on your confession. You were so blinded by greed and desperation that you did not even do a basic background check on the buyer. You just saw the cash and you took it. You committed grand larceny and you left a digital paper trail leading directly to your own bank account. Malcolm shook his head. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He looked at Chloe. He looked at Richard. They were all staring at him in complete shock. The foundation of their perfect wedding was built on a felony. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. I stood there tall and unmoving. I was not the poor old mechanic they thought I was. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was not finished yet. Just then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the reception hall swung open. every head in the room turned to look. Evelyn, my corporate lawyer, walked through the doors holding a thick stack of legal briefs. She was wearing a sharp black suit and walking with the confident stride of a woman who held the power to ruin lives. Her heels clicked loudly against the marble floor as she made her way down the center aisle. I pointed toward her so the entire room could see. "Evelyn here is my chief legal counsel," I announced, "and she has been very busy today while you were busy taking wedding photos." Malcolm looked at Evelyn and his eyes widened with absolute panic. He knew who she was. He knew she did not play games. Evelyn walked right up to the stage and stood beside me. She handed me the top document from her stack. I did not need to read it. I already knew exactly what it said. I looked over at Richard, who was still standing near his seat, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. "Richard," I said, my voice projecting across the silent ballroom. When Malcolm pushed that fraudulent sale through, he bypassed the standard title search. He was in too much of a hurry to get his hands on the cash. If he had done a proper search, he would have seen that the Southside lot was not just an empty piece of land. Evelyn here just officially notified the Internal Revenue Service of the transfer. You see, Richard, I used that specific property as a corporate shield. It had a massive, deliberate tax lien attached to it, $500,000 in federal back taxes to be exact. I watched Richard's face contort in confusion and rising dread. I explained it to him very slowly. By transferring that property fraudulently, Malcolm legally assumed all the debts attached to it. But he did not just bring himself down. Because you were so desperate to fund this wedding, Richard, you used your failing logistics company to underwrite the wire transfer. You co-signed his predatory loan using that stolen money as collateral. You tied your name and your business to his federal crime. Therefore, by the laws of the federal tax code, Malcolm and you have just jointly absorbed $500,000 in federal debt. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. Evelyn stood beside me, nodding in confirmation. The documents were already filed. The IRS automated system was already moving to freeze their accounts. They had tried to build a high society empire on my dime. Now they were $500,000 in debt to the most unforgiving collection agency in the world. The crushing weight of the numbers filled the room. The white and gold aesthetic of the wedding meant nothing anymore. They were bankrupt, and they were facing federal prison. The reality of the situation crashed down on Richard like a concrete wall. The illusion of his immense wealth and power evaporated in a single second. He turned away from me and launched himself toward the sweetheart table. His face was purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Malcolm. "You told me the property was clean," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with absolute fury. "You told me it was an unencumbered asset. You used my company to underwrite the wire transfer. You dragged my business into a federal fraud investigation. You ruined me." Malcolm tried to step back, but he stumbled over the train of Chloe wedding dress. He put his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "Richard, I did not know." Malcolm pleaded, his voice high and frantic. "I swear I did not know about the tax lien. I thought it was just dirt." Richard grabbed the edge of the table, shaking it violently. "I am going to federal prison because of you," Richard roared. "My assets are going to be seized, you arrogant, stupid little boy." Susan Chloe, mother, let out a loud gasp. The crystal champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, breaking the final spell of their high society facade. The wealthy guests sitting at the surrounding tables began to murmur loudly. The polite silence was completely gone, replaced by the chaotic buzzing of gossip and shock. I looked out at the crowd and saw dozens of city councilmen and corporate executives pulling out their smartphones. They were holding them up, recording the spectacular downfall of Richard Logistics' empire and my son fake wedding. The pristine white and gold aesthetic of the ballroom was completely destroyed by cold, hard numbers. The expensive imported orchids and the melting ice sculptures looked ridiculous now. They were nothing more than crime scene evidence. Chloe stood frozen, her perfect bridal makeup ruined by tears of panic and humiliation. I watched him trade his dignity for a seat at their table. Now he had traded his freedom. Gordon Evelyn asked softly, "What do you want me to do? Do I freeze the transfer? Do I call the authorities right now?" I opened my eyes. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard discipline that had kept me alive in this business for 40 years. "No," I said. "Let the money clear into his account. Let him feel rich today." "But Gordon, if we let this process, it becomes a completed federal crime." "I know," I replied. "Malcolm wants to pretend he is a king. He wants to throw a lavish wedding with stolen money and treat me like a peasant in the back row. He told me not to embarrass him. So I will respect his wishes. I will not embarrass him today. I paused, feeling the weight of the decision. Evelyn, I want you to run a full financial audit on Chloe's parents. Richard and Susan have been boasting about paying for this wedding, but I smell a rat. Find out exactly where their money is coming from. She looked at the giant floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers, realizing none of it was paid for. She realized she had not married into hidden wealth. She had just legally tied herself to a felon who was $500,000 in debt. She looked at Malcolm with pure hatred, her hands shaking as she gripped her expensive silk dress. The beautiful empire they had promised to build together during their vows was already a burning pile of ash. I stood on the stage watching the chaos unfold. I did not feel any pity for them. They had invited this destruction upon themselves. They had believed that money could buy them respect and that arrogance could protect them from consequences. They had underestimated the quiet old mechanic from the south side. The house of cards had finally fallen, and I was the one who had pulled the bottom card. The chaos in the ballroom was absolute, but Chloe refused to accept defeat. She stood up from the sweetheart table and her chair crashed backward onto the imported marble floor. Her face was twisted with pure entitlement and sudden rage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, telling me to get out of her sight. She shouted that I was ruining her perfect day and that I had no right to be there. She turned her frantic eyes toward the private security guards standing near the exit. She commanded them to grab me and throw me out of her venue immediately. She yelled that I was a trespasser and a criminal. The two large men in black suits stepped forward, but they hesitated. They looked at the expensive suits of the terrified guests, and then they looked at Evelyn, who stood beside me, radiating absolute legal authority. They looked at my face and saw a man who was completely unbothered by a screaming bride. I did not step back. I did not flinch. Instead, a sound began to rumble deep inside my chest. It started as a low chuckle, and then it grew into a deep, booming laugh. It was a laugh built on 40 years of surviving people exactly like her. It echoed through the massive surround sound speakers filling the entire estate. Chloe stopped screaming. Her mouth hung open in shock. She did not understand how a poor old mechanic could laugh in the face of her high society wrath. She thought her white dress and her father money gave her absolute power over me. She had no idea how powerless she truly was. I stopped laughing and looked at her with a cold, piercing stare. I raised my hand and signaled to Evelyn. Evelyn did not hesitate. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick black binder. It was heavy and filled with certified legal documents. She handed it to me with a slight nod of respect. I held the binder in my hand, feeling the weight of the ultimate truth. Chloe watched me, her breathing shallow and erratic. She still thought she was the queen of the castle. She was about to find out that the castle never belonged to her. I walked slowly down the steps of the stage, holding the black binder. The guests parted like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to stand in my way. City councilmen and corporate executives stepped back, avoiding my gaze. They had spent the entire evening looking down on me, and now they were terrified of me. I walked straight toward the sweetheart table where Chloe was standing. Her hands were shaking so badly that the diamond bracelets on her wrists rattled. Malcolm was still leaning against the table, looking like a broken, hollow shell of a man. I did not even look at my son. My attention was entirely focused on the arrogant young woman who had demanded I do manual labor for her just a few hours ago. The security guards remained frozen in their spots. They knew better than to intervene. Evelyn followed closely behind me, acting as my silent enforcer. Every step I took dismantled another piece of Chloe's artificial kingdom. She screamed again, demanding to know why the guards were not moving. She yelled that her father paid them a fortune to protect her venue from trash like me. The word trash slipped from her lips so easily. It was the word she had probably used behind my back since the day she met my son. I stopped right in front of her table. I looked at Chloe and repeated her words slowly. "Your venue," I asked, my voice echoing through the silent room. "You think this is your venue?" I lifted the thick black binder and tossed it directly onto the center of the bride table. It landed with a heavy thud right on top of her expensive floral centerpiece, crushing the white orchids. The sound made Richard jump from where he was standing. I looked at Richard and then back to Chloe. Richard rented this magnificent estate through a high-end corporate broker, I explained calmly. He wanted the absolute best location in the city to show off his imaginary wealth. He wanted to impress all these wealthy guests sitting around us tonight. But Richard was in such a desperate hurry to secure the location and hide his failing finances that he did not bother to read the fine print on the rental agreement. I pointed at the black binder resting on the crushed flowers. If you or your bankrupt father had actually looked at your lease agreement, Chloe, you would have seen the name of the holding company that owns this entire property. You would have seen the corporate entity that collects your massive rental fees. Richard slowly reached out with a trembling hand and opened the cover of the binder. He stared at the certified deed of trust on the very first page. I watched the remaining blood drain from his face. He looked like he was going to be sick right there on the marble floor. "I bought this entire estate 5 years ago," I announced to the room. "I paid for it in cash. Every single brick, every crystal chandelier, every blade of grass on this manicured lawn belongs to me." Chloe stared at me in total disbelief. She looked down at the documents and then looked at her father, begging him to tell her it was a lie. But Richard could not speak. He just closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands. The crushing realization hit Chloe like a freight train. She owned nothing. Her family owned nothing. They were just temporary guests paying exorbitant rent to the very man they had spent the entire weekend humiliating. The massive stone mansion, the private lake, the pristine white and gold ballroom, it was all my property. She had ordered security to throw me out of a building that I legally owned. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. I walked around the table slowly, letting the reality of the situation sink into the minds of every person in the room. The wealthy elites who had laughed at me during the toasts were now staring at the floor in absolute shame. They realized they were sitting in my chairs, eating from my plates, and drinking under my roof. I looked at Malcolm. He was weeping silently, tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfect white tuxedo. He had tried to buy his way into a wealthy family by stealing from me, only to discover that his father was already the king of the world he was trying to enter. If he had just been an honest son, if he had just respected his roots, he would have inherited all of this. But greed had blinded him completely. I turned my back to Malcolm and Chloe and faced the crowd. I picked up the wireless microphone from the table. I held it firmly, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of pale, terrified faces. I leaned into the microphone and my voice resonated with the power of a man who had survived decades of discrimination and hardship. "You are standing on a black man property," I said. Every single syllable fell like a hammer blow in the quiet ballroom. "You paid for this extravagant wedding with a black man's stolen money. You drank my champagne. You ate my food. You stood on a stage I own and made racist jokes about rescuing my son from the streets. You looked at my faded suit and my rough hands, and you thought I was nothing. You thought you were inherently better than me because of the color of your skin and the illusion of your wealth." I turned my head and locked eyes with Chloe. "And you, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that echoed everywhere. "You had the absolute audacity to call me this morning and order me to carry your heavy oak tables. You treated the owner of this multi-million-dollar estate like an unpaid servant, because you could not fathom a world where a man who looks like me could be more powerful than a family that looks like yours." Complete and suffocating silence filled the room. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The breathing of 300 people seemed to stop all at once. The wealthy socialites and the arrogant corporate executives were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their own ignorance. They had been entirely stripped of their superiority. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently that it left them breathless. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had turned wrenches and hauled concrete blocks 40 years ago, the same hands that had built an empire in the shadows while men like Richard played dress-up in the light. I did not need a custom Navy suit to prove my worth. I did not need a $500 bottle of wine to command respect. I possessed something they could never buy with a predatory loan. I possessed absolute leverage. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that forced every single person in that ballroom to reflect on their own prejudice and their own fragile egos. "And Evelyn, prepare the documents for Apex Holdings. We are going to attend a wedding tomorrow." "Understood, Gordon," Evelyn said. "You are going to let him dig the hole all the way to the bottom, are you not?" "He already dug the hole, Evelyn," I said. "Tomorrow, I am just going to hand him the shovel." I hung up the phone. The morning sun was finally breaking through the window, casting a warm light over my office. I walked over to the closet and pulled out the cheap, ill-fitting suit Malcolm had sent to my house the day before. It was an insult made of cheap fabric designed to make me look exactly like the poor, uneducated old man they all believed me to be. I ran my hand over the rough collar. I would wear this suit. I would play the part perfectly. They wanted a helpless old fool who knew his place. That is exactly what they would get right up until the moment I tore their perfect fake world to the ground. Friday evening arrived with a cold, biting wind. I looked at Richard, who was leaning against the wall, defeated and broken. I looked at Susan, who was hiding her face behind her hands. I looked at Chloe, who was staring at her ruined wedding dress, knowing that it was paid for with stolen money that would soon put her new husband in federal prison. I had given them exactly what they asked for. They wanted a wedding nobody would ever forget. They wanted an event that would be the talk of the high society circles for years to come. I had delivered beyond their wildest dreams. They would remember this night for the rest of their lives. They would remember the night the quiet old mechanic from the South Side walked into their glittering white and gold palace and burned it to the ground without striking a single match. I lowered the microphone and placed it gently on the table next to the crushed white orchids. I did not need to say another word. The silence spoke loud enough for everyone. The heavy silence in the ballroom finally snapped. It did not break with a whisper, but shattered with a violent, explosive roar. The illusion of high-class society and the fragile mask of elegance completely vanished in the blink of an eye. Richard saw his logistics empire burn to the ground. His personal wealth was gone and his freedom was hanging by a thread. The reality of the federal tax lien and the wire fraud investigation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. He was a cornered animal, and his survival instinct kicked in with blind, terrifying rage. He let out a primal yell that echoed through the crystal chandeliers. Richard lunged forward across the marble floor. He did not care about the city councilmen watching him. He did not care about the corporate executives holding up their phones to record every second of his humiliation. He launched himself directly at Malcolm. He reached out with trembling, furious hands and grabbed my son by the lapels of his custom white tuxedo. He gripped the expensive fabric, twisting it in his fists, and shoved Malcolm backward with brutal force. "You ruined me!" Richard screamed as his face turned a dark, violent shade of purple. "You told me that land was clean. You told me the wire transfer was secure. I am going to federal prison because of you. I am going to lose everything because of your stupid, greedy lies." Malcolm stumbled backward, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He tried to pry Richard's hands off his chest, but the older man was fueled by pure, desperate adrenaline. Malcolm was no longer the confident groom who had threatened me in the restroom. He was a scared little boy getting manhandled in front of 300 people. Richard shoved him again, pushing him further back toward the massive dessert display. Malcolm lost his footing on the smooth marble floor. He waved his arms wildly, trying to catch his balance, but he collided heavily with the display table. The table tipped backward. Sitting in the center of that table was a $5,000 wedding cake. It was a 5-tier masterpiece covered in edible gold leaf and imported white roses. It tilted in slow motion, and then it fell. The massive cake crashed onto the floor with a wet, heavy thud. Layers of vanilla sponge and expensive buttercream splattered across the pristine marble. The golden decorations shattered into pieces. Malcolm fell right into the wreckage. His custom white tuxedo was instantly ruined, smeared with frosting and cake batter. He scrambled backward, slipping on the mess, looking like a pathetic clown. The wealthy guests gasped and jumped away to protect their expensive shoes. The polite high society wedding had officially devolved into a street brawl. Chloe stood frozen as the $5,000 cake splattered across the floor. Her eyes darted from the ruined dessert to her father, who was still screaming obscenities, and then to the man she had just married. Malcolm was sitting on the floor covered in frosting, looking utterly pathetic. The fairy tale was over. The beautiful lie she had crafted was completely exposed. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had not married a rising star with hidden family wealth. She had not married an easy target whose pension she could drain to save her father from bankruptcy. She had married a convicted felon. She had legally tied herself to a man who was currently sitting on $500,000 of federal debt. The hostile takeover she had bragged about in the bridal suite had completely backfired. Absolute panic washed over her face, replacing her arrogant smirk with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked around the room at her wealthy friends. The people she had wanted to impress were now pointing their phones at her, recording her ultimate humiliation. She could not handle the embarrassment. She raised her hands to her head and let out a piercing, hysterical scream.